Now let's hope she's good enough at avoiding trouble to stay alive. Maybe I'll give her a hand in getting some practice in.
Well, time to make good on that promise. Having already completed Leon's story twice and Ada's only once, I figured it was time to approach the damageless run. Quickly going over the rules, just bear with me for a sec. Difficulty, professional. Weapons, everything fully upgraded and allowed for the purposes of the run, including bonus weapons. Game completion bonuses, enabled. Infinite rocket launcher, no. Infinite rocket launcher at home, yes. Allowed number of saves that I want, infinite. And of course, the most essential rule of all, if at any point I take any damage, I have to go back to my most recent save point.
Hey, real quick, if you could do that, subscribe, like, comment, all that good YouTube stuff, it would help me out a lot. I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, let's get moving. I don't think anyone really likes this part.
So, something that I realized playing through this game is that for all the jokes I've made about Ashley getting regularly kidnapped, I didn't realize that Luis gets kidnapped almost as much. With Ashley, it kind of makes sense. You know, she's a teenager and probably hasn't been exposed to many dangerous situations. But Luis has shown multiple times to be pretty capable and a competent fighter, and the fact that both Leon and Ada have to rescue him multiple times might just be because he enjoys these kind of situations. I'm not judging, it's just something I noticed. After getting him out of the dungeon, we walked over to the merchant, who I swear is not here normally, but I just can't be bothered to actually prove that fact, before heading into the first black robe fight. My strategy for this one was mostly the same as when I did S+, which is basically keep your distance and pepper shots as much as you can when you have the opportunity. When he brings out the shadow clones, I knew the most effective strategy would be to disperse as many of them as I possibly could at the same time, so I ran into a corner and used the explosive crossbow for crowd control, inadvertently ending the fight. Escaping the castle is where the actual difficulty of the chapter came from. For the first attempt, I decided to try destroying the catapults as quickly as I could. This was not the right strategy, as it meant that enemies started to home in on me right away. This also meant that I had to redo the black robe fight and realize I was making things way more difficult on myself than they needed to be, because I could just use the sweeper to clean house. The second attempt was generally a lot better, mostly because I decided to stealth my way through the enemies before moving to the final area, where an arrow managed to perfectly thread the needle and hit me as I was moving past it. The third attempt showed me that sometimes turtling isn't a very effective survival strategy, as well as the fact that shotguns are largely unreliable in this game. But on the fourth attempt, I was able to get through there doing the same thing I did in the second attempt, but instead taking a moment to pause and get rid of one of the catapults in the battlements before climbing the ladder, using explosives to take out whatever enemies were on top, and using the cannon as a functional enough shield to protect me from any more arrows. The start of Chapter 2 really should not have been as difficult as it was. The Stingray let me take down most enemies from a distance, so starting any encounter wasn't too bad, but the problem was what came after. Whether it would be flying arrows that strike me with the accuracy of an aimbot, or projectile hatchets, or enemies sneaking up on me from behind, or mismanagement of explosives, or getting kicked in the butt, or my inability to aim, or any number of different things, yeah, this one just took way too long. To be fair, it's probably a lot shorter than I remember it feeling, but it was very annoying. Eventually, I decided on a strategy of scorching the earth, while making sure to take care of whatever enemies were outside of my normal reach with the Stingray. The biggest challenge at the cliffside was just making sure I remembered what the puzzle solution was, before heading over to the church, ringing the bell to save Leon, which really puts into perspective how much surviving a scenario like this comes down to luck and having good partners. I then took care of the enemies who were coming to the church, mostly just because I could, and because I have an unofficial rule of trying to tackle every challenge I can when doing this kind of run. On to Black Robe Round 2. This fight was pretty easy. Having learned how efficient it is to be a cleaner at all times, by keeping my distance it meant that I would have enough time to stop firing, react, and dodge whenever necessary. While having more clones did make this a little trickier, ultimately the strategy holds true. Fire when you're safe, run when you're in trouble, and repeat. When it got to the point of there being 3 clones at the same time, I ran into a corner trying to force spawns of certain clones in areas where I could make sure that I would still be safe, but that they wouldn't be able to spawn behind me. I still probably got lucky here a few times, but ultimately this fight was quick, letting me finish the chapter by saving Leon a second time. At the beginning of Chapter 3, I ran into a small, unavoidable problem. You see, in one of the very first cutscenes, we get grabbed by Mendez, and that is, unfortunately, a hit. Even when I had to do this area a second time, I couldn't avoid taking the hit, almost like it's scripted or something. And if you're wondering why I had to do this a second time, let's just say that explosives are not melee weapons. Deciding to soldier on, because there was really nothing I could do about that one, I worked my way through the chase sequence after equipping a more suitable, though less effective, melee weapon. Heading into the factory, dispatching the earlier enemies was a pretty simple affair, at which point I made my way down to the basement. And let me just say, I am very glad there's only a handful of tripping balls moments in Ada's campaign. In Leon's, these things are all over the place, and it's really annoying, especially when you're trying to beat the game in a certain time frame. Anyways, after getting back in contact with Luis, I made my way carefully back through the factory, ensuring that I swept up any enemies that showed up. I prefer to be a very thorough cleaner. After escaping the factory, Ada promptly passes out and is rescued by Wesker, something that I imagine would actually be quite terrifying in context considering who this guy is. Also, something that I didn't catch on to earlier, it's pretty likely that Wesker stole Ada's blood in this scene, which is probably how he clones her later. But no one likes to talk about that game, so I won't. After the least comfortable nap in the world, I took care of these two enemies before having a very uneventful stroll through the village, running over to the cabin where I was interrupted by a giant. Now, normally, giants are, well, a giant pain to deal with because they have stupidly inflated hitboxes and are bullet sponges. But that's not quite the case this time, because Ada has a grappling hook, and that is very effective at making distance. So, after taking as many pot shots as I possibly could using the crossbow and bringing it home with a light dusting of bullets, Ada the Giant Slayer was on her way. And I've gotta say, considering there's a scene of Ada literally stepping on a giant's corpse, and then this shot with Luis immediately after, I think Resident Evil writers know very well what kind of demographic they're catering to with this character, and I don't think they're gonna complain. At the start of Chapter 4, Ada has a totally justifiable crash out in response to being told by Luis that she's going to be sent on another fetch quest. It's not like she can refuse or anything. I mean, the man literally runs into a flaming room when Ada says no initially, so it seems like we're getting ingredients. Also, one thing I want to address really quickly, Ada's maximum inventory size with the cat ears equipped is such that you can have literally every single weapon in her arsenal available at all times, which I think is really neat and kinda wish was the case with Leon. Anyways, the red ink in the bindery was fairly simple to come across, leading to the first real interaction Ada and Leon have in about 6 years, and I've gotta say, I could have picked a worse date spot. But while the ink was easy, the wine was less so. Being defended by a group of armaduras would be bad enough, but it doesn't help that I also had to deal with crossbow enemies who are notorious for dealing damage out of nowhere. See, armaduras are tricky for two main reasons. One, they're typically in rather cramped areas, meaning you don't have a lot of space to move, and two, they've got the biggest hitboxes in the game aside from giants in the black robe. On paper, it would seem like an easy solution. Just take out a couple armaduras, get rid of the crossbow enemies before they can do any damage, and you're home free. But it's a little trickier since the crossbow enemies continually respawn.
Funnily enough, this is actually one of the few times where I think Ada's run is consistently harder than Leon's. Back when I did that run, I had a few big reasons as to why I allowed the body armor to be a sort of shield for damage. There were a bunch of different reasons for this, but one of the biggest ones was that it always felt a little cheap when you got hit by an arrow from an enemy you just couldn't see. I never really saw any comments on this video, so I didn't know how people really reacted to it, but either way, that's not really a problem in this case.
This meant I had to be constantly worried about crossbow enemies ruining the run at any given moment, so it was time to strategize. After grabbing the bottle initially, I made as much distance as I could between the first two armaduras that spawned in and myself, sweeping them up and then moving over to the third in the upper right corner. From here, I baited an attack and got myself into the corner the armadura was previously in, just as the crossbow enemy showed up. Taking care of the one on the upper right, I made sure to stay as close to that area as I could, so that the other crossbow enemy wouldn't be able to get a clean shot on me. Yet another functional enough shield. As the other armaduras continued to spawn in, I mowed them down as quickly as I could, and with all the knights nighty-nighted, the last crossbow enemy was easy pickings. Finally, moving on to the hedge maze, one might not consider trimming it to be a part of a cleaner's job, but personally speaking, I think it's an absolutely necessary part of upholding the keep. With all the ingredients acquired, it was time for Luis to go full Breaking Bad, a joke that I am only including on the off chance that my friend watches this video and gets a little hit of dopamine. And now for what is normally the longest chapter in the run. Moving down into the waterway, it was time to get reacquainted with one of my least favorite things in the world, bugs. Where's the comically large can of Raid when you need it? I decided to skip using the shortcut at the start of the chapter, mostly because I figured there would be a big enemy encounter, but honestly, I probably could have used it as it was just a minor time save and didn't net any enemies that I wouldn't have seen on my path otherwise. After draining the waterway, it was time to deal with the creepy crawlies yet again, and let me just say, I hate these things. I don't care if they telegraph their attacks. I don't care if they have low HP and go down easily. I don't even care that I have memorized their spawn points because they piss me off that much. These things can burn. They are entirely too fast, moving in very unpredictable patterns, and no matter what you do, even if you know where they're spawning in front of you, and you are constantly aiming and firing at the areas that you know they spawn from, you will still get hit sometimes, because the game just decides that you miss. They are only in 2 chapters of this game, and that is so fortunate, because in Leon's, they are there for the final third, and I have to deal with these massive annoyances for a very short time in Ada's, but that does not make them any more pleasant. Don't worry, we will get back to these little buggers later. For now, though, it's time to tackle Ada's version of the double Garrador fight. Now, having beaten this game multiple times, I'm well aware that the main method of dealing with Garradors is explosives, and considering I have a bottomless reserve of them, that certainly sounds doable. In fact, I actually managed to beat these guys on my first attempt, only to get projectile hatcheted out of nowhere because this game hates me, and also I don't know how to look up. Fortunately, the second attempt was pretty easy, letting us move right along to the final Black Robe fight. So, fun fact about Phase 1, it's laughably easy with unlimited ammo. See, the crossbow arrows actually stun this guy and force him into a bit of a stumbling animation, and that's just so coincidentally enough time for you to reload, letting you continually stagger him until you effectively just win the fight by default. Nah, the real trouble is with the tail. While I did have the funds to purchase a rocket launcher, I wanted to fight this guy legitimately, just because I hadn't done it for a while, and I figured it would be more compelling and a complete telling of the run. Which might have been a mistake, as this thing did prove tricky, although not insurmountable. The main thing to keep track of in this fight are these little spikes that the worm guy leaves all over the stage, which explode on contact and are very easy to miss when you're not looking directly under your feet, which is probably most of the time when you're dealing with a thing in front of you that is currently trying to end you. Add on to that the fact that this is an incredibly fast leaping bites, which aren't super well telegraphed, and it can definitely be difficult to know when or even where you need to dodge to keep safe. And to make matters even better, midway through the fight, it summons more bugs. As if I wasn't having enough fun. Also, this game has a bad habit of eating inputs at the best possible times, such as when you swear you hit that dodge prompt, or swear you hit that knife prompt, only for the game to tell you no, now go back and do the whole thing all over again, which is just lovely. So, what's the strategy? At the start of the fight, I pulled out the sweeper and aimed directly for the stomach, continually unloading until it eventually ducks down. From here, it was a bit down to luck. I essentially just had to hope that it didn't pop out of the ground and spew spikes all over the place. Most of the time, though, I could safely-ish continue to fire at the stomach until we entered Phase 2. When it would fall down for the knife prompt, I got in as much damage as I could before activating the prompt to deal a massive chunk of damage all at once. But as I went in for the knife, I also equipped a flashbang and would throw it as soon as I landed, disabling any of the bugs that would spawn in long enough for me to finish things up. Although, I feel I might have accidentally skipped the trigger, considering that in the final attempt no bugs showed up, but I was still able to finish the fight. So, it's possible I just did too much damage for it to reasonably have enough time to call for backup. Whatever the reason, it was time to move on to the final stretch of the chapter. When I got to the scaffolding area with the crank door, I opened the door just enough to see the enemies poke out, and then realized I didn't have to deal with them because I have the power of explosives on my side, letting me get into the mountainside fairly easily. From here, I generally just did the usual thing of moving slowly and taking down enemies, as well as moving through the rock crusher with much more patience than I usually would. I have died to these things enough times to know that running through was not an option here. In the final area, I made sure to dispatch as many enemies as I could with the world's best boomstick yet again before heading off to the boat and meeting up with Leon. The beginning of Chapter 6 served as a solid reminder of 2 very important facts. 1, shotguns are not reliable at melee range, and 2, knife prompts will fail when you need them to the most. I did think the construction site was going to prove to be a much bigger challenge, though. I mean, the area has a brute who is already a bullet sponge, and then you add another brute with a Gatling crossbow, which seems really cool and probably impossible, plus a few Plagas you have to defeat at the same time. Somehow, despite all these typically very powerful enemies converging on my butt at the same time, I was still able to beat the encounter first try, but don't expect that to last. Moving on through the rest of the chapter, it was fairly easy to take down the regenerators that showed up, thanks to the Stingray showing me their weak points, as well as using explosives to take care of the enemies that spawned right outside the lab, but the problem here lied with one particular enemy, the Iron Maiden. So, remember how I said earlier that we'd be talking about my lack of body armor again? Yeah, this enemy is why. The Iron Maiden has far more weak points than your typical Regenerator, but it also has one attack that is incredibly impossible to avoid. Once you damage enough bugs, the Maiden will launch a barrage of little spikes that are impossible to block and will hit you even if you are corner peeking effectively. The other major problem is that if you go too far around the corner, the enemies will likely end up rushing you before you have a chance to take it down, so this guy presented a major roadblock. A roadblock which I surprisingly found a solution to by complete and total accident. After defeating the Regenerator that was right in front of the Maiden, I struck it with a few shots before running back because I really didn't have much of a strategy and was just panicking. But as it turns out, the Iron Maiden can't actually leave the room that you first encounter it in, so it was puppy guarding the door. By timing a flash just when I opened up said door, I was able to run out of the area, reconnect the power coupling, and head on to the pillbox section. Which, no joke, I was expecting to take a few days. The whole point of the pillbox section is that you're able to use a sniper in order to take down enemies before they can get into contact with you, with the major problem being that they're all ranged enemies. It's meant to be a reward for competent players who can aim their shots consistently by taking out enemies before they can do any sort of damage to you, or before they can pose a threat. Which, in my case, meant I had to take them down before they could even get a single shot off, because a single one of theirs landing meant I had to reset. Fortunately enough, I was actually able to do this first try. I'm not entirely sure how, but I was able to consistently hit all my shots to a degree that none of the enemies were able to do anything in response. A section that I figured would probably have me stuck for a while ended up being one of the quickest in the game. Go figure. This led to the final big encounter of Chapter 6. Taking down the two ramparts using explosive crossbow, I have to say, it is really upsetting to me that I was able to consistently disable the ramparts when I was barely paying attention to where I was aiming in comparison to when I was doing this in S+, and was sitting like an inch away from my computer screen to make sure I lined it up properly. Unfortunately though, while I was able to dispatch most of the enemies that were bugging me at the start, they kept on coming and eventually I was taken by surprise. Tackling it again, this time I decided to be much more liberal with my use of explosives, doing some light cleaning inside the tent to take out the brute, stinging a few enemies that showed up with the ray as I made my final approach, getting some quick revenge, and moving on to the laser lab. This section isn't any different from normal. Blast the wall here in order to get a small shortcut, and fire an explosive arrow just to see what happens, because this enemy doesn't actually move from the spot. Continue on to the laser grid, and make sure you time your movements correctly such that you avoid the ouchies. Struck with a crisis of conscience for the first time in this game, Ada finally decides to help Leon, something that she's been doing the whole time, but it's selfless now, I guess, speeding off to Chapter 7. Now this one was the real kicker. The first stretch of Chapter 7 is not too difficult with a fully upgraded arsenal. None of the enemies are going to present much of a threat. Preparing for the Sadler fight, I feel I need to acknowledge something quickly. I've had it as a running joke on this channel that I've never actually fought this guy, and at a certain point I feel like it's deliberately robbing myself of the enjoyment that could potentially come from taking him on legitimately. But that doesn't mean I'm going to stop the bit anytime soon. Go bigger boomstick. And for anyone saying I said no rocket launcher at the start, that's incorrect. I said no infinite rocket launcher. Single use is fine if you really think about it. Nah, the hard part is what comes after. See, after defeating Sadler, there's still one more major firefight that you have to go through, and this one is probably the hardest because you're on a time limit. Enemies are typically fairly spread out, meaning you have to pick and choose your targets, and considering a lot of them have projectiles, it can be a little difficult to prioritize enemies properly. This is especially doubled when you consider there are also enemies like brutes in this area, which, as mentioned before, can tank all of your damage and make it so they are effectively shielding other enemies who will then proceed to hit you with projectiles. Right at the beginning, I had a strategy of firing off explosive arrows at this little gap in fencing, which would typically take down two crossbow-wielding enemies that would show up and sometimes damage you if you ignored them when reaching the first grapple point. But this was inconsistent, as sometimes they would just be perfectly fine for no adequately explained reason. Anyways, with that minor frustration accounted for, I really just did whatever I could to ensure that all the enemies were defeated before moving on to the next section. While there is a time limit, it's not really that tight, so you can, to a degree, take your time here. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for this next bit. After collecting the rocket launcher special, you then have to move through the rest of the compound in order to get it over to Leon. Problem is, there are a few enemies here that are a lot of trouble to deal with. First and foremost, there's a few rocket launcher enemies who must be defeated if you don't want to instantly die, although I suppose anything in this run technically counts for that, but you get the idea. And of course, they couldn't make it any more easy on you because they also felt it was necessary to introduce more bugs. Yup, couldn't leave these guys behind in Chapter 5, could we? No, they just had to swarm on in again. Fortunately, the same strategy I used for the big spiny worm thing worked here just as well. Flash the bugs so they won't bother you, blow up the eyeball inside this tentacle, and move on. The one good thing is that these bugs are only on this crane, so they're not gonna bother you for too long, but that has the unfortunate side effect of meaning they're essentially just an annoyance that will potentially end your run halfway through this long section. And what's even worse is that's the hardest part about this whole area. Once you get past the crane, you are effectively home free. I mean, yeah, sure, there's still a lot of enemies that will show up, but once again, being a diligent cleaner ensures you're not gonna have any bloodstains to deal with later. Sending Sadler off with one final blowout, it was time to say goodbye. In a scene that really doesn't make any sense when you consider that Ada literally just betrayed Wesker in order to save Leon, she grabs the amber and escapes using an umbrella helicopter. I mean, sure, she does betray him a few minutes later, but it's still strange to think about her having an entire scene dedicated to showing that she's going to be a better person, only for her to not do that less than an hour later. But I guess if she's good enough to dodge bullets, then responsibility for her actions is just another thing that I've taught her to avoid.